topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Welcome to Leadership for Life with Gina Gardner on W4CY Radio and Talk4 TV. Join your host, who is a multiple #1 international best-selling author, motivational speaker, empowerment and transformational leadership coach and trainer. She's the founder of Genuinely Hyphen You and has 30 years experience of helping people step into their genuine, authentic power. And now, here is Gina Gardner, your host of Leadership for Life.
Hello there, and welcome to today's show. We're going to do things rather differently today. I've got a great guest, my friend Benn Abdy-Collins. He has an amazing wealth of experience around helping people deal with loss, bereavement. The title of the show is around dealing with loss in its broadest terms, and everybody in life will have gone through some loss or other. And for many people, that's really poignant at the moment. In fact, in this week, it's poignant for me too, because 2 very close family members have died in the last week. It's interesting, isn't it, how even when people are, getting on in age, one was 82 and one was 87, and it's not a tragedy, it's still very sad, and there is still that sense of loss. But I want to talk about loss in a constructive way and loss in the broadest possible way today. And we'd love to know your feelings, your comments, and so on. And we hope that what we're offering today will be of help to you if you are facing loss of one sort or another. So let me give you Benn's bio. Benn Abdy-Collins, mentor dealing with loss and midlife transitions, medical herbalist, civil funeral celebrant. He enables people to creatively find their way through complex times, emotions, grief, the losses they face, and he facilitates their goodbyes to both their loved ones and circumstances that they face as problems in their lives. He listens, he mentors, he writes, and he speaks. He seeks solutions in the infinite genius. Sorry about that. That's actually the radio station phoning me back. Sorry about that interruption. So let me read the last bit again. He facilitates the goodbyes to both their loved ones and circumstances they face as problems in their lives. He listens, he mentors, he writes, he speaks, and he seeks solutions in the infinite genius and power of individuals, families, and communities. So, without more ado, let me welcome Benn Abdy-Collins to come and join me. Ben.
Good evening,
Hi.
Gina. I think it's hot this evening. Excuse me, I am slightly more flushed than usual. It's called standing around in the sun for a long time doing a funeral service today. So my apologies for being ever so slightly red, but it's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure.
It's lovely to have you. It's an interesting topic, isn't it? And I think that for so many people, they tend not to talk about loss, particularly bereavement. If we'd gone back 50 or 100 years when death was very much a part of daily living. People died of infection, of accident, a whole range of things. If you were under 5 pounds born at the turn of the last century, you were unlikely to survive beyond the age of 5. So we live in a world where our expectation of life is greater, and our capacity to deal with it, I believe, is diminished because we don't talk about it. It's a taboo subject. And so not only are you dealing with the loss, but you're dealing with the fact that everything's so unfamiliar. We were talking about it earlier today because we've had a couple of deaths in the extended family in the last week. And there was a time when there was a very set grieving process. You don't have to go back too far when everybody wore black, and that you grieved for a set amount of time, and the colours that you wore represented where you were in the process. And to an extent, that still happens for some religions now. I have an uncle who is Jewish, and when he died, there was a very strict protocol. And I think for many people that can be helpful. But you have a huge wealth of experience of dealing with people who are dealing with perhaps the most difficult things in their life, which is the loss of a loved one. What are your thoughts about how to approach the whole business of losing someone that you love?
How long have you got?
Well, we've got about 45 minutes, and I have set aside the whole show, not to just talk about bereavement, but losses of any sort.
Sure. The thing is, it's very strange, actually. Many people find that it's possible to have humor at the time of grief, and it seems wrong. And when I'm conducting a funeral service that I've written, there are quite often funny parts to it, and some congregations that I speak to will laugh, and many of them won't, because they think it's inappropriate to laugh during a funeral service. But you pointed to history. Not too long ago, in England, we used to have the parlour. I think it's the same in the US. You have the parlour, and you only go in there on special occasions. But if someone died, you would put them in a coffin, and you would put the coffin on the parlour table, and everyone would come in, and they would pay their respects. Yeah. They'd have a cup of tea, and they would sit around the coffin. Nowadays, people don't do that. We've medicalised and scientificized, Benn language, the situation of death, and death is treated as certainly dirty, much more so given the current pandemic scenario that's going on in the world. And so we've lost the behaviors and rituals of normalizing what's happened around the time of death, and therefore we've put it beyond ordinary. It's an extraordinary experience, but if it's every day, like it was, as you say, earlier in life, earlier in time, people didn't treat it so preciously as we do now. I think we've got stuck in this thing of, I'm immortal, I don't have problems, I don't deal with things like that.
Yeah.
And that actually becomes a huge barrier to the conversations that we could, ought, should, two words to avoid, ought and should, actually discuss. Because if we don't, all that happens is that we get a pressure inside. If you look at the mental health statistics these days, they are frightening. And most of them come from the denial of the anger, the denial of the grief, the denial of the fact that I am frightened, from which a lot of anger comes from. And if I am frightened as a human being, and I make up a percentage of the population who also might be frightened and also angry, and therefore anxious and depressed, hence the antidepressants that go on, the psychiatric units that are busy, the mental health departments, and so on and so forth, they're missing a trick. They're missing that whole thing of human engagement, because when we engage, when we listen, when we love and we turn a listening ear, yes, I'm biased, true, look at my name, but it is when we build that relationship with someone else's heart rather than trying to get into someone else's head, then we have the possibility of doing something remarkable and special and unique in the relationship we have with each other, because at that point we can be empathetic and compassionate. So only when we do it in that sort of way, in my personal opinion, it is purely my opinion, then we have an opportunity, then we have a possibility to have the conversations about, why did someone that we loved and cared for commit suicide? Why did someone we know and loved and cared for drink themselves to death? Why did we lose a younger sibling under the most remarkable circumstances? Why was someone's life foreshortened from what we hoped it was going to be? These are some of these things are services I've currently got in process, or partly, as you'll recognize, they're conversations that you and I have had because of your own circumstances of life. Life is often very complex, but we can make it simpler by having these constructive, considered, compassionate, understanding conversations, because someone actually listens. In the world of sound bites, no one listens.
I think this is true of life in its entirety. We're talking about loss, but it's true for everything. There are a few things I want to pick up there. And I think often we don't know what to say. You know, people, I've heard that term, I just don't know what to say. And it's interesting when you look at the reactions. I'm thinking of a friend now, Trixie, a great friend, and her father died. And one of the things that upset her, actually more than his death, was that there's certain people that she considered close friends avoided her. And she went back to work. She was a teacher, and she went back to work, and it was as if nothing had happened. Nobody mentioned, nobody said sorry about your dad. That's all it would take. Are you okay? It was as if the waters had closed over the event and it had never happened. And I think of other situations. Ben was alluding, I think, to the fact that my brother, at the age of 49, went out to do the London to Brighton cycle race last practice and just dropped dead. He fell off his bike. He had medics who were in his team who were running cycling for charity, in fact, for the British Heart Foundation. But they couldn't resuscitate him. He was dead before he hit the floor. And there was a seemingly incredibly healthy guy, did lots of sport, looked after himself, and bigger than life, and suddenly he wasn't there. And through my life, I've had many bereavements of people close to me, but each one is quite unique. The circumstances, the how it makes you feel, the how other people deal with you. And I think if you're listening to this and you are not necessarily the bereaved person, but somebody who knows someone who's lost a loved one, all you need to do is to just listen, is to say, I haven't got the right words, but I'm here and I will listen. And that's just gold. That's treasure, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, okay, I balk at saying this, but I'm in the trade, and I have no idea what to say to people. I thought when I trained in bereavement care, I would know what to say. I know less about what to say now than I did at the beginning of training. I talk to people about having lost their person in order to be able to represent that in a funeral service, which means I've only yesterday I was talking to someone. She came home and her loving, funny, caring, beautiful man was hanging by the neck. I didn't know what to say. If I sound like I'm falling over my words, it's because I did not know what to say. I didn't use that. I didn't talk about that. I just said, look, I'm here to help you. It's about simplicity. It's about creating a beautiful service. I didn't bring in what had happened.
Yeah.
Because it's not appropriate. I just needed to be possibly a slightly bumbling, caring individual that reached out to connect with someone who is hurting massively. 3 weeks ago she had a bloke. 3 weeks ago she didn't have a bloke.
It just seems to me that holding the space for someone authentically and really just being in that space with them and allowing them to pour forth whatever needs to come. No judgment, no filters, no second guessing, just being is one of the most powerful things that you can do for people.
Sure. And I'm constantly an observer. It's one of the things that I do all of the time. I observe. And something I've noticed when I was working face to face with families, obviously I haven't been during pandemic, but I would find within 5 to 10 minutes of meeting the family face to face, sitting down with a cup of tea or whatever we were doing, there would be a little bit of a chuckle or a little bit of a laugh. I have no idea what happened before that thing, but it broke the ice. And sometimes I ask the occasionally slightly obtuse question or the slightly daft question. I don't make statement of like, well, that was a stupid thing to do, but I will ask did they ever do anything daft? Or are there any situations when this happened or that happened? Because they begin to get involved in the personality of the quirks or the habits or the hobbies or the interests of the individual, because they will make up life, our personalities, and how we're ever so slightly eccentric. I will admit I'm not slightly eccentric. I'm probably very eccentric.
Just
But
take away the probably, Ben. Just
but it makes for creating a relationship. And if you actually look at many coaches, many therapists, we tend to have worked on ourselves. We tend to recognize that we're slight oddballs, but because we're slight oddballs, we can connect with the genuinely oddball aspects of the people who consider themselves to be sane and struggling and suffering. And loss, as you've said, in a greater context, turns up in so many other ways beyond the grief we associate with bereavement. And I think that's an important part, because that lack of recognition that the two of them are powerfully connected, I think they have a dynamic between them that is scarily strong. And I think it's something that we need to break the taboo of in this conversation. So where would you like to go, Gina, please? I know it's a passion of yours as well.
Well, we're going to have a break in a couple of minutes, and
Surely.
we're going to talk about loss in the broader sense after the break. But before we do, humour is an interesting one. And
Sure.
I don't know whether it's just our family, but humour has always been very prevalent, and certainly, and we've had quite a large number of losses over the years. It's humour that has broken that sense of doom, and I don't think I can cope with it. And then somebody would crack a joke, or somebody would find something that actually wasn't very funny, but find it funny and start to laugh, and everybody would join in. And I think one of the things that has always helped our family is looking to celebrate the person's life. Who were they? What sort of person were they? What was their legacy? And I don't mean the legacy in terms of the crown jewels, but in terms of the people that they touched. And going back to my brother, who died very suddenly, his funeral was probably one of the best days of my life, paradoxically, and one of the worst days of my life. And hundreds of people turned up to his funeral service. They couldn't fit in the church, they were outside. It was a beautiful day. It was very early June, late June, and the skylarks were singing. And as we went down to where he'd chosen to have a burial, nature was at its very, very best. We went off to the wake, and all the way through the afternoon, people were coming up to me and saying, "You don't know me, and I didn't know your brother very well, but he helped me out." Or, "You don't know this, but David did this, and he didn't say anything to anybody, but he came and he rescued me, or he helped me." And it was those seemingly small acts of kindness, of compassion, of thoughtfulness that made the big difference. And it was one of the things that really helped me after he died, which is to really reassess what was important in life. And unusually for a guy, one of the things that David was very good at was keeping in touch with friends and family. But he did it in a very specific way. And my brother was very irreverent. And I'll tell you a funny story about him and my dad in a moment. And ultimately, with all of David's, and it could be incredibly annoying, that recognizing that his messages, which would say, "Just love ya," LUVYA, 5 letters, but it meant such a lot because you knew that he was thinking of you. And so if you're listening to this, please get in touch with people, talk to people, send them a text, tell them that you love them, tell them you care, tell them you appreciate them, and do it often, because it was one of the things that really helped me. Have no regrets. Don't wish you had made up with the people that you hadn't spoken to. I'm reminded of a friend who was estranged from her dad, and she was getting married, and I said, "Please, please, Make contact with your father, and even if he's not walking you up the aisle, invite him to come to the wedding. She did, and 2 weeks later he died. And so she didn't have to deal with all of the regrets that she hadn't actually made contact with him. But before we go to the break, I'm going to share a story. It's a typical family story, I have to say. My father had died the year before. He was almost 89. So at his age, he was healthy right up until very close to the end. So he'd had a great life. And I didn't collect his ashes. He was cremated. And then a year later, just over a year later, my brother died. And it was decided that he was going to be buried. And so we decided that we'd put my dad's ashes in with the coffin. So I collected the ashes. And the first thing that I did is that I was driving up to go and stay with my sister, ready for the funeral the next day. And I left the ashes behind, and I had to come all the way back and pick them up. And I could hear my father's voice saying, "There she goes again, you'd forget your head if it wasn't screwed on." And that made me chuckle. And then we went to put the ashes in the coffin, and the only place that they would fit was between David's feet. And it was a standing joke. My father was always teasing my brother about his smelly feet, and when he was a teenager. And it tickled the family no end to think that in perpetuity that his ashes were between my brother's feet. And it just made us laugh. And I think that when you can find the humour in things, it is a great leveller and a great lightener. So we're going to talk about loss in the broadest sense after the break. So don't go away. We've got much more for you.
You have been listening to Gina Gardner on Leadership for Life. We'll be back after this quick break. Want to get the best out of life personally and professionally? Are you ready to step into a life which excites and fulfills you? Well, the right place for you is Leadership for Life with Gina Gardner on W4CY Radio and Talk4 TV. We will share with you stories from inspiring people, a wide range of guest experts, and lots of practical strategies to help you get the very best out of your personal and professional life. Leadership for Life is a radio and TV show focused on helping you live a happier, more successful, and fulfilling life. Join international best-selling author, motivational speaker, empowerment and transformational leadership coach and trainer, Gina Gardner, live every Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time on W4CY Radio and Talk4 TV. Become the leader of your own life. Gina Gardner's #1 international best-selling book, Thriving Not Surviving, The 5 Secret Pathways to Happiness, Success, and Fulfillment, provides you with the foundational principles on which to become the best leader of your own life. It's available as an ebook, paperback, hardback, and as an audio from genuinely-u.com, or also from Amazon. Every one of the principles have been proven to work for the countless people who have used them, including the author. Now, let's put them to work for you. If you're ready to discover your true leadership life design, accelerate your journey with an invitation to join Gina for Leadership for Life VIP Day. Choose your journey of self-discovery where Gina will help you navigate your way to happiness, success, and fulfillment. To find out more, email Gina at genuinely-u.com. Welcome back to Leadership for Life. Here is your host, Gina Gardner.
Lovely to have you back. And in this half of the show, we're going to be talking about loss in its broader sense. We've been talking about bereavement. And I don't want to in any way close off the conversation about bereavement, but we were talking before the show about how many people have an expectation of how life will be, and then it doesn't turn out as you want it. And there's that sense of loss and very often bereavement. And at a personal level, I've got lots of examples of this, but I've also worked with many people who've been made redundant or who have become disabled, or, they've lost their house, or they've lost a relationship that's broken down. And so loss comes in so many different forms. I know that one of the parts of the conversation we had was with service children who are pulled from place to place, who lose their friends, lose their sense of stability. So when you think about loss in the broadest sense, then, what are your thoughts?
I was born into a Royal Naval family in Scotland. It was 1964, and in the 60s, if you suffered from postnatal depression, you were put into, or you were held within a psychiatric unit to keep your child safe, just in case, because I was breastfed. Therefore, my mum couldn't be given any medicines because I needed to be fed and cared for. So I lived on a psychiatric ward pretty soon after being born at home. Then my father was scheduled to move to the south coast of England. So we left Scotland, went to the south coast of England, stayed in quarters. My dad realised that if he stayed in the Navy, he would never have a home. So we bought a house, we lived there. And then when I was 4, they started filling me with vaccines to go and live in Nigeria. So we lived in Lagos in Nigeria. Just before my 7th birthday, I returned back to the UK for decimalisation and my first experience of snow. So began a life of a lot of change. And I changed countries. I mean, as anyone will know, if you go and live in a country that's in South America, the African countries, or the Middle or Far East, they are very, very different places to the UK. And it's a bit of an adventure, but it's also quite unsettling. So by the time I've hit 7, I've lived at something like 7 different addresses. You know, by the time I hit 40, I'd lived at 41.
Goodness me.
But I've been here now for almost 17 years. So, you know, and I've been to something like 8 or 9 schools and colleges. I've done this, I've done that. You know, it's a lot of change. And I'm not unique. I'm one of millions of kids in the world who either are, as the Americans call them, military brats, missionary kids, foreign service brats, UK forces kids. There's a term for us now, which is actually called third culture kids, where we're born into one culture, we live in another one, but we make our own version out of it. So you might find someone is born in Umbala. I met someone who's born in Umbala. I think her father was out there for economic reasons, but she was told she was English, but she only came to England later on. Or my cousin was made and born in Nigeria. Made in Nigeria, born in the UK, I believe, stayed in Nigeria until he was of boarding school age, then brought himself up in boarding school when there was no phones. You got a little blue airmail letter once a week or once a month, but that was it. That was his life. You know, he saw more of our grandmother because she was in the same town as the boarding school. But that was it. That was his life, and he would see his parents occasionally at Christmas and each summer, and that. He had to make his own culture, and many kids do that. I'm sorry, Gina, go.
I was going to say, I've done a lot of work with social workers, foster care children, and with schools. And, you know, I think about the life chances of children who are in foster care. And because they are uprooted, they don't have any stability, that they are often, certainly in the UK, moved from pillar to post. They don't go to one foster home and stay. They're often moved about for all sorts of reasons. And you know, at the time when children are their most vulnerable, who need stability more than anything, because that's when they're learning who they are and about the world. And how, you know, I've worked with many people who've been to boarding school, for example, who have been military brats, and I know you have, and their sense of self very often. Well, one of two things happens. Either through the experience, they become incredibly strong and cope very well because they have become self-sufficient, or they struggle and they look for anesthetics like food or alcohol or drugs, sex, shopping, whatever. And I think, those people who are watching or listening to this, if you are someone who's been through that third culture child experience and you're struggling, then you really need to reach out and get some help, because it can be so damaging.
And the thing is, it's this whole thing of vulnerability. This is what we're actually talking about here in so many different respects. We, as human beings, are vulnerable.
We are indeed.
From the moment that we are born, we're not Bambi. We're not on some plane waiting to run away from a tiger. If we're on a plane, it's a lion, isn't it? If it's jungle, it's a tiger. But we are vulnerable, and we build codependent bonds with other people for our own survival. It's breast milk for mummy, it's nappies changed, it's making sure that we are safe and secure. If we are having those bonds of healthy-ish attachment challenged, we become very challenged, and then it's very confusing. It's confusing enough to grow up in any family, but when the bonds aren't there, it is far more confusing. This is what I think, what you're pointing to here with foster kids. They don't get that opportunity to bond. And I think if you're a military kid or a foreign service brat or a missionary kid, you're constantly going through change. Every time you get used to something, it shifts. So you might be with parents in the same place for 25 years.
Yes.
But it's backwards and forwards to boarding school, it's backwards and forwards to hospital, it's backwards and forwards to... And it's all in the name of what someone else feels it should be done, whether or not it's an economic reason, a political reason, a military reason, or in the name of the theism that is part of the missionary. So whether or not it's Christian, or whether or not it's Muslim, whatever it is, it's fundamentally a challenge to the child, who then feels guilty for trying to buck the system and go, hey, I have needs too. As foster kids all do. Yes. Hey, I have needs too. I am feeling vulnerable. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to cope with it. This is scaring me. So I get anxious. I act out. I take drugs. Or I get tough, which, as you say, is the other reaction or response. And some of the most remarkable people on the planet are people who come from broken backgrounds, and they've made good. But I'm like many other people. I'm a highly sensitive individual.
Yeah.
I naturally am an empath. It means I feel stuff, and I feel stuff more than perhaps an average person does.
Well, I was going to say
many other people do.
You feel, each of us feels in our own particular way. Again, There's a lot to unpack, and I would say there's a lot of science now around attachment disorder in children, and they think that approximately a third, I suspect it's higher after the pandemic, of young children and young people have attachment disorders. And interestingly, attachment disorder isn't only about the relationship the person has with them and with others, but also your capacity to know right from wrong, to understand cause and consequence, to recognize the implications of time, for example. And so the knock-on effect on people's life chances is so much bigger than what people recognize. Kids are resilient, they'll deal with the move, that's not a problem. But in the end, they either become very gregarious but don't actually form lasting relationships, because what's the point? Because we're moving in 4 months' time. And so they skid along the surface of relationships, or they make a relationship and then they go through the bereavement process because that relationship struggles to last over distance and over time.
Sure. I mean, my name covered it up, but I did a very big shrug a short while ago, because for the sensitive child, of which I'm not unique, I just
not at all.
About mine. This sort of stuff, it is a demonizing process on a daily basis. It literally, it causes a problem, because we talk about the community outside of ourselves and the connections that we have, and we talk about family. But what we forget is that we have a community indoors as well. And some of when you were talking about attachment theory and attachment dysfunction, it's the relationships within the community within inside the self is dysfunctional.
Yeah.
Then there is no attachment to oneself. Therefore, there is no rooting. Therefore, there is no place in the world, because all that you and I and other practitioners of a similar sort of ilk are doing is seeking to bring the rootedness back into the individual, because place don't have no meaning if there ain't no rooting. I know that's not good English, but most of us, I think, understand where I'm coming from.
That sense of self, that sense of who we are, is the central tenet on which everything is built.
Absolutely.
And when that is built on shaky foundations, it makes everything more difficult. But if you take the same principles of fear and anxiety, and you put that into this situation for military children who they're saying goodbye to mummy or daddy, and it's not as if they have any certainty whether they're going to see them again. And so they're not only dealing with the absence of a parent, but the consistent anxiety as to whether that parent is actually going to return.
Sure.
So you add layer upon layer upon layer of uncertainty. And one thing that we all require is that sense of security, safety, survival.
Without which we feel vulnerable.
Now, I really want to, what we could spend a week talking about this.
Only a week. Only
a
a week.
lifetime, yeah. But I want to broaden it out to different sorts of loss. So my family has, I should think like any other family, when you scratch the surface, there's all sorts of things going on. So when my sister has 2 children, and when Matthew, the eldest one, was 5, he was diagnosed with a very, very rare condition, life-limiting and progressive, mentally and physically disabling. And very sadly, the youngest one, who was very lively, at 1.5, was diagnosed with the same thing. And I watched my sister and her husband cope with the fact that their dreams and expectations for healthy children who would go through school and go to university and get married and have grandchildren was, in the moment of discovering what was wrong with them, that whole dream was completely annihilated. And I'm very proud of the way that they've dealt with what has been an incredibly difficult situation. But I'm reminded of a conversation I had with my sister, and she doesn't talk about it very often, but said to her, how does it feel? And she said, well, imagine you're going on a holiday to Hawaii, and you're all packed and you're all excited and you're going and you're raring to go and you're going to Hawaii, and you get off the plane and you're not in Hawaii, that you're actually in Rotterdam, in the industrial part, and it's flat and it's industrial and it's grey. And she said the interesting thing is that over time you accommodate and you get to be very fond of Rotterdam. It's not Hawaii, and it doesn't have the vibrant life and all of that Hawaii was going to offer you, but actually it's still very special. And that seemed to me a really wise way of looking at things, because disappointments in our life, as you know, I'm a wheelchair user. When I fell down the mountain, I didn't know that my life was going to be changed. And there was a period of loss and bereavement. But the gifts that have come out of it have been incredible. The unique leadership program has come out of necessity, because I couldn't physically get into the rooms. So people had to take responsibility. People are made redundant. How many people have you worked with who've been made redundant, and 2 years later you talk to them and they say, it's the best thing that ever happened. It gave me an opportunity to reevaluate what was important. And so our dealing with loss and recognizing that loss is a part of life, even the language is interesting, isn't it? If we haven't lost somebody, they're not lost. We know where they are. We know what's happened. So in your work with people, What help do you offer them when they come to you for a transition because they're grieving that life isn't quite as they wanted?
With your introduction to that question, I was sitting here remembering a sort of remembering a Zen proverb. It is that the blocks of life are not blocks; they are the way, they are the path.
Mm-hmm.
And it is fascinating to see that when we feel vulnerable, we feel that we have blocks in our way and we feel that we cannot cope. And that actually is something that we shouldn't be suffering from. So there's often a guilt or a shame, or there's an avoidance process, which is what you've pointed to, and several different ways in which you've talked during this thing. And the first thing I do is I accept someone. And I listen, provide love, provide care, and I seek to earth what they're feeling and tell them it's all right to feel flaky in some way, shape, manner, or form, and be caring. And that's about it. It's about kindness. It's about compassion. And then if that is present and we have that in our communication, myself and my client, then things begin to change because their perception has a chance to shift from I'm broken to I might be dysfunctional, I might be weird, but you know what? I'm actually okay and I can do something about it.
That's really wise, I think. For me, I think one of the shifts in focus is from what you haven't got to what you have.
Yeah, well, you've got Rotterdam. All right, it's not Hawaii, but you've got your kids. Stuff has happened. It ain't right, but you can still make the best of it. I think what happens is people get caught up with, I haven't got, I want more, I want different. Therefore, they lose 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years of life and potential to be something remarkable because something isn't what I want.
So for me, there are certain emotional states that really help this. One is the state of gratitude for what you have.
Yes.
And I think, even those who I've worked with who've been incredibly depressed and anxious, when they start to collect gratitudes and make that part of their daily practice, there's a recalibration of their brain, and they start to focus on the positives in life rather than the negatives. And you always get more of what you focus on. So the more you focus on the positive, the more that happens. But the other thing I think is forgiveness. And I think, whether you're dealing with people who've been abused or this been abused by the system, and in a sense, the third culture children, in a sense, have been abused by the system, is recognizing that actually holding on to the hurt and the frustration and all of those things does nothing but keep you stuck in the power of the past rather than moving forward. Because ultimately, when you start to forgive yourself and others, you let go of those chains, you break those chains and you can move forward. But transitions are interesting, aren't they? Because there are few constants in life. We've got death, that's a constant, because from the moment we're born, we know at some point we're going to die. Taxes, because if you live, particularly in the Western world, somebody's going to tax you. And the third is change. That you know that we are changing from the moment we are conceived right the way through to the moment that we die. And yet we struggle with those transitions, don't we?
Well, it's that big river in Africa called denial, which is the joke that stands in the 12-step programs. But we deny things. I think we've become stuck in our heads in the West, and I think we try to infect other countries with the same sort of thing. If I stay in my head, I'll be safe.
Yeah.
I can deny things exist. I can deny my feelings. I can deny this. I can outthink stuff, and I can time manage. I can manage my stuff. I can do what I want. But look at the people who snort stuff, drink stuff, have dysfunctional behaviours that you pointed so clearly early on in the conversation. They are attempted adaptations of trying to suppress everything and keep a lid on it. It ain't healthy.
No.
It's a simple line of all of this.
It's like trying to keep a dragon in a box.
Oh,
And the
absolutely.
minute that the box starts to move, that actually keeping that dragon down is nigh on impossible.
Sure.
I find it interesting when people talk about positive emotions and negative emotions. And I have to say, in many ways, it's an easy description. But I think a lot of the emotions that people designate as being negative are there to offer us the opportunity to learn about ourselves or the world. And that when we deny them, they gather strength.
Yeah.
Whereas if you acknowledge them and sit with them and just allow them to be what they are, it's not the emotion itself, it's what you do with it that makes the difference. So anger in and of itself is not negative, but if you are aggressive and you go and hurt somebody, then that behavior is negative. So I think dealing with the grief that life has not turned out as you wanted, the grief of a relationship going wrong and dissolving, whether that relationship is with a child, a parent, an intimate relationship with your partner or your boss or one of your colleagues. You know, ultimately, you're the common denominator. You decide how you deal with things. And it's not the challenge that defines us, it's what you do with it. But many people get stuck in their heads, as you say, tunnel vision, and they can't see past the fact that somebody's been unfair or somebody's hurt them or something just doesn't fit right. And so the damage that's done by the initial assault of whatever that was, and I don't mean a physical assault, the emotional assault, continues and becomes deeper and wider and more difficult to deal with.
Well, I think this is a conversation we could, as you said, we could have for a long time. But I think personally, it comes down to our perception is everything.
Yeah.
If we change our perception and realize within the challenge there is a beautiful gift and a possible solution that can make all the difference in the world, we've got a good start point. But it all starts with someone listens. Someone listens to themselves, or someone outside of them listens and pays attention to the fact they need to say something.
So what I would say to all of you, if you're watching this or listening to this, playing the download, is give someone the gift of your time, of your truly actively listening. No phone, no looking at the telly, no thinking about the shopping list. Just be there for them. Now, we've got very few minutes left, and one of the things that we do on Leadership for Life is I invite every guest to choose one of the projects from B1G1. B1, buy one, give one. And we are very pleased to be members of B1G1. And you were offered the 3 options, and you chose giving water, clean water. What made you choose that, Ben?
Water. Without water, we die. And I've lived in an African country, and I know how complicated it is and how essential it is to make sure that someone is able to drink and to be able to live. And I think it's the most appropriate thing to do.
And so what we are going to do is to donate some funds towards a project in Tanzania to provide a well, a rope pump well, so that they will actually have clean water. And so they don't have to go miles carrying water and then it be unclean and disease-ridden. So thank you very much for that. Remember that every listener to B1G1, for every 100 listeners, we give free meals through B1G1. If you're a business owner and you would like to become a member of B1G1, in the show notes you'll find the Leadership for Life code. And if you use that code, then what you do gets seen as part the impacts. They call them impacts. Every little thing that you do is called an impact. And we get to see just how far we've fertilized the idea of giving through the show. So please do Make sure that you get other people to download the show, whether it's the TV on YouTube, Leadership W4CY, Leadership for Life, or on any of the major podcast platforms. And every time it's downloaded, it goes towards the count, and we give free meals or join. And they've separated the impacts to make them very affordable. They have a sister charity that raises all of the money for the admin. So every penny that we donate goes towards one of the projects. They're very well vetted, and they make sure that the money goes to the right place. So it remains for me to say a huge thank you, Ben. Ben, where can people get hold of you?
Well, BennAbdy-Collins.com. So my name, here we go. It's flashed up. So Ben, BENNABDY-Collins.com. Best thing to do, and my email address is Ben@BennAbdy-Collins. If you get BENN@BENNABDY-Collins.com, drop me a message. Best way to do it.
And there's lots of free resources to help you at genuinely-u.com. Lots of programs for you to engage in as a leader or as an empath on GinaGardnerAssociates.co.uk. But do reach out. If you want to have a chat with me, then it's Gina@genuinely-u.com. And I look forward to hearing from you. But thank you very much. If you are suffering from loss, then do reach out. Sending you lots of love. Thanks, Ben. Take care.
Thanks,
and
Gina.
we'll see you next week. Thanks very much. Whatever, become the leader of your own life.
You have been listening to The Leadership for Life with your host, Gina Gardner. Make sure you tune in to W4CY Radio and Talk 4 TV next Thursday and every Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for more Leadership for Life. If you missed any part of this episode or just want to hear or see it again, you can find the archive of the TV show on Talk 4 TV's YouTube channel and the podcast of The Leadership for Life on iHeartRadio, Pandora, Spotify, Amazon Music, and wherever you listen to your podcast.